Act 2021 and move that it be read now a second time.
Is there any objection to that motion? No objection. Carry on, Mr. Peace.
Yes, thank you so much, Madam President. Today, more than ever, all the hats that I wear are converging all at the same time. For those of you who don't know me very well, of course, I wear a few hats.
Mhm.
Of course, today I'm here as the government senator as well as the Minister of Youth, Culture, and Sport, but also professionally. I'm also an international certified counselor, and I spent the last 15, 20 years working in recovery and treatment for persons seeking relief from drug addiction. I also am a pastor, been pastoring now for the better part of 22, 23 years. As such, as I come before this honorable house today, I certainly recognize all of those fields and all of that experience. And I plan to do my level best this morning to bring all of those experiences together under one roof at one time. So let me report to this honorable house. This bill that we have in front of us today, it ushers in a new regulatory regime, licensing all activities involved directly or ancillary to the cultivation, import, export, production, sale, supply, use, or transport of cannabis, or medicinal cannabis, or products derived from cannabis or medicinal cannabis in Bermuda. The bill establishes the Cannabis Licensing Authority to be a statutory regulatory body to oversee the issuance of licenses, inspection, compliance, and enforcement of cannabis licensing regime. The authority will also make recommendation to the minister responsible for drug prevention on related policies, issues, and administration of said act. Provisions in this bill, Madam President, will permit lawful activities relating to the cannabis plant, medicinal cannabis, cannabis products, and cannabis-infused products. Madam President, this honorable chamber has before today a multifaceted and, in many opinions, a very transformative bill of what we believe is of significant national importance. As our society reimagines its relationship as well as its attitudes towards cannabis, the Honorable Learned Attorney General, the Minister of Legal Affairs and Constitutional Reform, gave a very stirring summation in regarding the historic injustices and disparities concerning how cannabis enforcement laws in this country have unfortunately disproportionately affected our Black male population. The essence of her speech is really, in my opinion, worth repeating for the members of this honorable chamber. Madam President, the pathways to reforming Bermuda's cannabis laws and also demystifying the cannabis plant to finally awaken to us all the many health, therapeutic, and social benefits is well long overdue. Our 49-year-old Misuse of Drugs Act 1972 is a carbon copy of the Misuse Drugs Act of 1971 in the United Kingdom. The UK itself is challenged with similar disparities of unequal enforcement of stop and search and low-level drug offenses arrests, particularly for cannabis recorded against Black and minority ethnic groups within its own borders. In Bermuda's half-century of cannabis laws, the evidence that cannabis laws were utilized as one of many tools by the colonial government and colonial police to quell Black disquiet and to systematically criminalize Blacks on the front lines of the racial progress movements is indisputable. This is in thanks to publications by homegrown historians like the late Cabinet Minister, the Honorable Walton Brown, and more recently, Dr. Swan. Madam President, looking back even further, there is a clear thread recognizing the very same inherently racialized enforcement, social disparities, and the social economic impact is woven throughout the findings of many reports, such as the Clark Report, 1978, the Pitt Report, 1978, the Gurr Report, 1984, the Archibald Report, 1986, the National Drug Strategy Proposal of 1991, and of course, the Truman Report of 1992, among others. Bermudian society must collectively confront, integrate, and dialogue with our past. We must also use today's knowledge respectfully of the aspirations of our future generations. This government has done this by continuing the big national conversation about cannabis, engaging the electorate by dynamic public consultation, and ultimately by bringing the cannabis licensing bill to the legislature. Madam President, the national dialogue has laid bare the fact that the social conditions of nearly 50 years of cannabis prohibition has not produced less cannabis use. Instead, the damaging social, economic, and health effects span generations in a very small, tight-knit community. Black Bermudian males continue to be disproportionately stopped, searched, and arrested by police for cannabis offenses. This is a direct gateway into the criminal justice system. Many of us have personal stories that demonstrate that there is a clear pipeline from the public education system to Westgate for some of our young Black males who, quote unquote, fall through the cracks or sometimes get, quote unquote, caught up. Black Bermudian males are overrepresented in all relevant cannabis-related matrices, even though it is proving that Blacks are no more prone to drug use or cannabis use for that matter, specifically than any other racial group. Madam President, the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, in his 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, gifted humanity with this perspective about when a law conflicts with the social conscience of society, quote unquote. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that his conscience tells him that is unjust and who willfully accepts imprisonment to arouse the consciousness of the community over said injustice is expressing the highest respect for the law. Dr. King's words still ring true to contemporary Bermudian society. We must reckon with the fact that criminalization of cannabis, primarily through the enforcement of personal use offenses in the Misuse of Drugs Act 1972, has been ineffective, it's discriminatory, it's very costly, and represents poor public policy in contemporary health and treatment models. Collateral consequences causes family separation, family breakdown, and personalized trauma throughout families affected by cannabis enforcement. Suspected cannabis users are stigmatized by certain segments of society, and persons convicted of cannabis offenses are endlessly excluded from jobs, housing, travel, and even educational opportunities. It is undeniable that cannabis use is a part of Bermuda's culture. Despite it being unlawful to trade, share, or even use, anyone who refuses to accept this simple truth does not see the truth. Cannabis use is not going away. Cannabis use is common at social gatherings, such as football matches, certainly at our cup match and other large public events. That is no secret. Essentially, unlawful use of cannabis happens in plain sight of police officers who are unable to effectively enforce cannabis laws at said events. Madam President, the data supporting the government's policy captured in the Bermuda Drug Information Network, sometimes known as BERDIN, 2018, in their annual report, I can highlight some of its salient figures. In the reporting year of 2017, some 71,160 grams of cannabis was seized. That includes plant seeds as well as edibles. This accounted for 84.5% of all drug seizures by weight. Criminal trials for cannabis possession were at 56, with a total of 18 trials for cannabis possessions with intent to supply. Contrasting convictions for cannabis offenses were also reported as follows. For possession, 47 convictions, intent to supply, 10 convictions, importation, 14 convictions, and for cultivation, 2 convictions. Only 11% of all total drug arrests in 2017 were for importation offenses. For the fiscal year ending 2017-18, a total estimate of $9 million was spent on drug treatment. 770,000 of that for drug prevention, and 5.7 million spent on drug enforcement and interdiction. Typically, the cumulative government spending for drug issues is approximately $15.5 million per year. And cannabis enforcement is overly represented and it's a drain on these public resources. Madam President, the status quo has not effectively been administered to deter illegal consumption and the trade of cannabis by any measure or any matrix. When faced with the paradox of these truths, how does a society progress from cannabis prohibition to legalization? That's the question. Thinking of it as a continuum, the stages of cannabis law reform are, of course, beginning with total prohibition, moving slightly towards decriminalization, then moving again to regulated medicinal cannabis, then again moving to responsible legal regulation of cannabis via a strict licensing regime, which this particular bill achieves, moving again to legalization with light touch of regulation, and then of course at the other end of the continuum, it is the full legalization of cannabis without regulation. Currently, there is an unregulated criminal market in Bermuda, with criminal sellers profiting off people who use cannabis most frequently. Conversely, full legalization without regulation will create an unregulated legal market, which would aptly supply the same tactics as the criminal market. This regulatory regime proposed in this bill will tackle criminality on either ends of the spectrum of cannabis reform. The research shows that the responsible legal regulation is the quote unquote sweet spot on the spectrum of cannabis reform. Madam President, if we look back, the PLP's cannabis reform agenda started in earnest back in 2014 in February when the PLP opposition tabled a bill in the House of Assembly which would decriminalize possession of up to 14 grams of cannabis. A further attempt by the PLP opposition to bring about decriminalization of cannabis won in the House of Assembly on the 20th of May, 2017. But it never made it into law because it triggered a motion of no confidence in the OBA minority government. The OBA avoided a vote of no confidence by asking the governor to dissolve the House of Assembly, triggering the general election on 18th of July, 2017. You would know, Madam President, the PLP won the 2017 election under a platform calling for cannabis reforms such as decriminalization, preventing young people from lost opportunities because of minor drug possessions, expanding license access to medicinal cannabis, and drug policy reforms in general. On the 20th of December 2017, the PLP government enacted the Misuse of Drugs Decriminalization of Cannabis Amendment Act of 2017, which decriminalized possession up to 7 grams of cannabis. In August 2020, the Expungement of Convictions Act of 2020 was enacted, expunging convictions for simple possession offenses committed before the 20th of December 2017. Madam President, the lay of the land. As far as what is lawfully permitted under the current law is as follows. As mentioned, possession of cannabis up to 7 grams is already decriminalized since 2017. Hemp and CBD formulations are also lawful for import, sale, and use in Bermuda since November of 2019. The legal definition of hemp is purposely defined to include cannabis, which contains concentrations of not more than 1% of THC. Further, approved medicinal cannabis pharmaceuticals like Marinol or Sativex are lawfully available for prescription in Bermuda. Other formulations of cannabis for medicinal purposes can be authorized for patients under a license by the minister responsible for the Misuse of Drugs Act 1972. Madam President, this government's effort to take the next logical step to a regulated medicinal cannabis regime was curtailed after public feedback was largely indifferent on said subject. Public consultation overwhelmingly showed that the public felt the cost, as well as the complexity and the proposed bureaucracy, outweighed any likely benefits for limited patients who would participate or for attracting prospective entrepreneurs and investors to set up medicinal cultivation and manufacturing businesses in our jurisdiction. The overarching call was for far bolder steps towards a responsible regulation of cannabis. The government took a deeper look at how far cannabis reforms could go, raising the decriminalization amount above 7 grams of cannabis, for example, similar to Portugal's model of wholesale decriminalization. This was not a feasible option for Bermuda's size as well as its limited resources. It would not be prudent to increase the decriminalized quantity of cannabis above 7 grams without additional safeguards, for example, or even a regulatory framework, because it gives tacit support to criminal enterprises engaging in legal supply, sales, importation, and the cultivation of cannabis. Likewise, as a government, full legalization of cannabis without a robust regulatory framework will likely have unintended consequences of increasing cannabis abuse and would not sufficiently dissuade cannabis use, eliminate the illegal cannabis market, nor prevent the known health risks associated with social harms. Madam President, the government's conclusion was that we needed a regulated cannabis regime tailored to Bermuda's needs, which improves public health, public safety, as well as our social outcomes, and which is not unjustifiably punitive. The Cannabis Licensing Bill establishes for Bermuda responsible regulation of cannabis via strict licensing regime. By enacting this bill, government agencies and stakeholders can work collaboratively to design an overall framework for cannabis that is cautious and can be enhanced as we monitor the health and other outcomes during the implementing phase going ahead. Madam President, crises are often a precursor for transformative change, and we are in an unprecedented economic crisis. I believe that goes without saying. This demands a radical new way of thinking. Increasingly, cannabis reform is not that radical at all. Opening up entrepreneurial opportunities for all in a post-COVID-19 regarding economic recovery, including for persons convicted of minor cannabis offenses, became a very necessary objective of the government's cannabis reform policy. Therefore, Madam President, the government anticipates that this bill's reforms will, over time, effectively curtail the persistent use of illegal cannabis market of unknown quantity as well as unknown potency, and that in the inherent exploitation within the criminal enterprise would eventually fade. The longer cannabis use remains criminalized, cannabis users would largely be out of reach of prevention and risk reduction protocols and treatment services without also, unfortunately, being caught up in the criminal justice system. Madam President, scientific advances and attitudes about cannabis now indicate that the health risks of using cannabis are lower than that of alcohol or tobacco. The dependence potential of cannabis is moderate to low, on par with, let's say, caffeine. However, local cannabis use data places cannabis and alcohol side by side as drugs of choice in Bermuda. Reported lifetime consumption rates are at 78.7% for alcohol, 76.5% for cannabis, and 70.4% for tobacco. There is no escaping the fact that alcohol and cannabis are cultural staples in this country, where almost 99% of people admit to taking the drug in their lifetime. Law and policy models around cannabis interventions globally are shifting their focus towards identifying persons at high risk, modifying risk factors and risky behaviors, and modeling responsible use. The same for alcohol, instead of an outdated criminality-focused model. Madam President, the cannabis reform policy follows leading science with signals that health risks for cannabis users are heightened for adolescents, persons with mental health challenges, or with a family history of such, individuals with cardiovascular problems, and pregnant women. These high risk factors can be worsened by initial cannabis use in early adulthood, nearly daily cannabis use, smoking cannabis plant material, and by consuming cannabis with excessively high THC levels. Because illegal cannabis is of an unknown quality, or could be laced with other more harmful chemicals or drugs. Available data suggests that contamination of street cannabis could be a very egregious aggravating factor for mental health challenges and the potential for psychosis. Madam President, the Cannabis Licensing Bill provisions effectively address each of these factors. The bill recognizes the need to protect young persons by restricting access to cannabis by discouraging inducements to cannabis use for persons under the age of 21. Specifically, persons under 21 will not be permitted to consume or use cannabis under this bill. It will be an offense to supply or sell cannabis to a person under the age of 21. Licenses will also have a duty to ensure that persons under 21 are not employed by retail shops, do not gain access to retail shops, and that cannabis or cannabis products or retail shops are not procured for persons under 21. Applicable offenses and penalties are included in this bill as well, with fines for noncompliance ranging between $8,000 to $40,000. Madam President, this bill's provisions also permit diversion programs to divert young persons found in possession of cannabis away from the criminal justice system. Rather, they will be directed into mandatory training and treatment programs. Madam President, examples of additional safeguards provided in the bill are as follows. Cultivation licenses and retail shop licenses are not permitted within 100 feet of any school or any place of worship. The minister may, by order, exclude harmful strains of cannabis from the licensing regime. Availability of cannabis is curtailed in approved premises that must meet stringent guidelines. Packaging of all cannabis products will be prescribed in regulated fashion. Supply chains for retail shops will need approval from the authority to keep out criminal elements and to verify potency and quality. Strict security requirements for licensed facilities must be maintained. And lastly, the authority will set terms and conditions for licenses for reasonable additional protections that are not currently prescribed in the law. As the regulatory regime expands, the minister will use regulation-making powers to address emergent technical requirements and enhance the protections as they are needed. An example would be that commercial sources of cannabis be subject to strictly defined controls regarding potency and purity, specifically regarding moisture, mold, fertilizers, pesticides, and fungicides, for example. Madam President, the public education campaigns and outreach will be properly executed so that young persons and the general public understand that the known dangers of cannabis abuse in the same manner as we educate on the dangers of alcohol and tobacco. The Department of National Drug Control and the authority will be tasked with collaborating to design and deliver effective targeted prevention campaigns to improve the understanding of drug abuse and the development of the best possible responses to it. The intended messaging will emphasize responsible adult use and will be sufficiently nuanced so that not to demonize the positive benefits of cannabis. Public messaging ought to coincide and reinforce other community-wide values exemplified by parents and family members, educational institutions, and society in general. In addition, the messaging will promote responsible attitudes and beliefs, which provide young people with the tools they need to decide on the most healthy course of action in regard to the use of potentially addictive substances. Research shows that educational programs focusing on learning on how to manage emotions and stress do better in addressing root causes of addiction and dissuading young people from using addictive substances rather than education programs focusing exclusively on drug abstinence. Madam President, licensed cannabis activities within the bill's licensing regime are ultimately designed to allow adults to access regulated, safe cannabis plant material, medicinal cannabis, cannabis products, and cannabis-infused products for medicinal, therapeutic, and responsible personal adult use. The licensing categories are as follows, Madam President. A Tier 1 cultivation license, that is to allow for the growing, harvesting, drying, trimming, or curing of limited amounts of cannabis for adult personal use. There's also a Tier 2 cultivation license, which allows for the growing, harvesting, drying, trimming, curing, and packaging of cannabis for medicinal cannabis for commercial purposes. There's also a cannabis retail shop license. This allows for the operation of a cannabis retail shop for the sale of cannabis or the sale and consumption of cannabis. There's also an import license to allow for the cannabis and medicinal cannabis planting material for cultivation from any country from which it is lawful to do so. There's also a Tier 1 manufacturing license, which is to allow for activities relating to the processing of edible cannabis, and a Tier 2 manufacturing license to allow for the manufacturing of cannabis products or medicinal cannabis products. There's also an export license to allow for the export of local cultivated cannabis to a country in which it's lawful to do so. A research license to allow for the conduct of scientific research relating to the development of medicinal cannabis. A transport license to allow for the transport of cannabis or medicinal cannabis in Bermuda. And lastly, a cannabis event license to allow for the sale and supply of cannabis at authorized private or public events of an infrequent or temporary nature. Madam President, collectively, the bill creates a strict, responsible regulation of cannabis to be enforced by the authority and the police, each empowered under the bill to control and regulate cannabis within the framework. HM Customs Department officers retain their role as well as their powers of protecting our borders against illegal drug importation. Ongoing cooperation between agencies will continue under this bill and is essential for the integrity of this regime. Madam President, another dimension of the bill is that the associated licensing fees are designed to avoid a situation of quote unquote champagne for the few instead of water for us all. That is to borrow from an African expression. It is the priority of this government to prioritize economic access to the licensing regime for all segments of our society. Entrepreneurial interest among Bermudians anxiously waiting to enter the market has noticeably ramped up as this bill has been making its way through the legislature. Much has been said by the OBA that the bill will not provide business opportunities for marginalized groups because of the quote unquote high fees and the high cost of doing business in Bermuda. However, this government was so committed to providing opportunities for the marginalized groups that it has included a provision in the bill expressly applying Section 6A of the Human Rights Act 1981 to allow for quote unquote special programs under the regulated cannabis regime. This will allow for the implementation of policies and programs directed to support and assist previously marginalized persons or groups to participate in the regulated industry. Madam President, this is the first time in legislative history that a Section 6A of the Human Rights Act of 1981 has been transposed into another legislative instrument. The terms of any special program are not prescribed in this bill, but will be for the minister responsible for the Cannabis Licensing Authority to work collaboratively to design any special program. A special program could, for example, take the form of reserving a percentage of the licenses or grant license fee reduction or waivers for specified groups. This is the Bermudian legislative way of offering equity pathways for persons formerly affected by prohibition to participate in the regulated cannabis market. Madam President, the licensing fees scheduled in the bill are accessible and affordable. Licensing fees range from $500 for Tier 1 cultivation license, $500 for transport license, $750 for private cannabis event license. License fees are higher for larger, complex, and high revenue business types, for example. The retail shop license and research license are set at $10,000. And Tier 2, the commercial cultivation license, will cost $6,000. The government is not legislating to give away startup capital to entrepreneurs, nor to handhold interested parties into the cannabis market. It follows that responsible regulation and responsible use of cannabis requires that personal responsibility is demonstrated by individuals wishing to enter the cannabis market. The Bermuda Economic Development Corporation, sometimes known as BEDC, offers a range of support, information resources, courses, and access to support for funding a startup business, including a popular loan program guarantee. Interested applicants for cannabis licenses would be signposted to avail themselves to the BEDC's range of resources and services to equip themselves to take full advantage of the regulated cannabis regime. This bill does not prescribe a cannabis tax. The government of Bermuda has not put a tax revenue ahead of first establishing a very viable framework and allowing the cannabis industry to stabilize. Madam President, this bill is the culmination of a comprehensive social justice reform project that included extensive consultation as well as stakeholder engagement from entities and experts across the health and helping services, including law enforcement, finance, and the justice system. To support the widest possible consultation, an illustrative draft bill was formed part of the consultation package and was also laid in the legislative for legislators to contribute. The underlying policy was revised during and after substantive public consultation. 150 members of the public, stakeholders, and interested entities made over 500 comments and submissions in total. Madam President, the consultation results aligned with liberal attitudes towards cannabis, demonstrating an overwhelming appetite for a wider lawful access to cannabis under a regulated regime. Not surprisingly, the quality of some consultation submissions uncovered substantial local cannabis expertise, waiting in the shadows and margins of society to take root. It is anticipated that our homegrown experts are readying themselves to start their lawful cannabis operations. Madam President, the government has been transparent about acknowledging that its cannabis reform policy opens up lawful activities for cannabis beyond medical, scientific, and industrial purposes. Responsible regulation of licenses, activities such as personal cultivation, retail licenses, and the personal adult use puts Bermuda policies up against the prescribed limits of the various narcotic conventions as articulated by the United Nations Treaty Oversight Body, the International Narcotics Control Board, sometimes known as the INCB. The INCB reclassified cannabis in December 2020, following the World Health Organization's recommendation recognizing the wider therapeutic and treatment benefits of cannabis, further indicating that it is not liable to produce ill effects similar to other drugs in Schedule 4, such as heroin, fentanyl, and other illicit opioids. Madam President, the government of Bermuda has consulted with the UK government House during this development of this bill. The government of Bermuda continues to pursue all diplomatic and legal options to deliver on its promise to our people, fully cognizant of the fact that the UK government's International Narcotics Convention's obligations as extended to Bermuda. However, Bermuda, as a self-governing territory of the UK, democratically desires, for social, cultural, and public health reasons, to chart its own distinct course in this difficult area of cannabis reform, while also adhering to international law to the greatest extent possible. Diplomatic discussions continue in this regard, with the hope that the UK will respect the democratically expressed wishes of the Bermudian electorate on this particular issue. Madam President, it is clear that Bermuda is now met with a unique dilemma. Continue to wait in vain for the INCB and the state parties to narcotic conventions to catch up with the modern attitudes on cannabis, or to meet the potential international challenges head on. The government of Bermuda has chosen the latter because waiting would mean missing the narrow window of time to establish a national cannabis industry that can deliver real change and economic opportunities for the Bermudian people. Madam President, Bermuda is not alone in this particular endeavor. The pathway to regulated cannabis legal framework has been trailblazed, by example, by Canada, which has regulated cannabis industry, and 36 states within the United States of America, which have laws permitting access to medicinal cannabis and/or recreational cannabis use. Other jurisdictions farther afield, like Uruguay, for example, have completely regulated cannabis sector. Mexico's legal cannabis industry is expected to come online by the end of 2021. Remarkably, Mexico's legalization was driven by a Supreme Court ruling that cannabis use falls under constitutionally protected modes of individual self-expression, and that same country in Mexico desires to eradicate the drug cartels. Canada and the United States have, by enacting domestic laws permitting personal adult use of cannabis and creating a regulatory framework for cannabis industry, are in a position of respectful non-compliance in regard to the International Narcotics Convention, notwithstanding that neither country has been subject to any sanction by the INCB, despite Canada being called an international rebel and the INCB declaring its legislative regime to be, quote unquote, weakening the drug treaty framework. Respectfully, Madam President, it would be disingenuous for the INCB to take such a hardline approach against Bermuda's cannabis laws in the face of two G7 state parties to the convention notoriously in non-compliance with their treaty obligations. Madam President, the cannabis policies and laws emanating from the Americas and the Caribbean region are more coherent with local views as well as cultural attitudes towards cannabis. Prevailing views in these regions, like those in Bermuda, recognize that contemporary science and risk-based harm reduction strategies are far more effective at preventing cannabis misuse and illegal trades in cannabis than a prohibition-only approach advocated by the INCB. The cannabis laws from the model jurisdictions informing this bill are sensibly consistent with the overall object and purpose of the Narcotic Convention, that is to be, quote unquote, concerned with the health and welfare of mankind. This government believes that a regulated cannabis industry, even one which permits responsible adult use, has greater likelihood of safeguarding the health and welfare of our population than the current state of affairs. System that criminalizes users and continue to proliferate despite all the best law enforcement efforts to suppress it. Madam President, cannabis has already gone mainstream. Cannabis industries are emerging and growing steadily in all of our gateway neighbors. In designing this bill, government technical officers recommended principally following Canada's example and adapted to meet Bermuda's jurisdictional distinctions. The government of Bermuda is bold enough to chart its own course on cannabis creating economic opportunities for our citizens. The bill presented opens the door for a viable, vibrant, and equitable cannabis industry. The framework encourages entry to business for small and medium-sized entrepreneurs as well as large companies, even chefs, bakers, juice bars can apply for licenses to manufacture cannabis food products. There will not be large monopolies dominating the cannabis industry. Madam President, constructing an entirely new regulated industry requires continuous legislative amendments and regulations. This bill is the foundational framing of a cannabis industry in Bermuda. The first piece of legislation cannot possibly, particularly at this stage, capture every eventuality. It cannot answer every single technical challenge the industry may face, nor can it be tailored to match the myriad of business issues that are likely to arise in the future. As the provisions of this bill are operationalized, the Cannabis Licensing Authority will collaborate with technical experts, industry partners, entrepreneurs, investors, and the banking industry and the Office of the National Anti-Money Laundering Committee to influence the future design of added regulatory specifications within the existing licensing regime. With their collective expertise, they will have the best understanding of the potential risk associated with any ambiguities in the licensing regime, and also identify ways of improving security issues, safeguards, and dynamics from within the specific areas in which they operate. Thus, regulation-making powers are included within the legislation, allowing the minister responsible to make specific and general regulations to enhance the regulated regime. Additionally, the Principal Act can be amended by regulation to include future development. This government's policy is not blind to potential risk of money laundering, which can emerge from formerly illegal businesses now becoming lawful, particularly for the proceeds of crime and effective border controls to guard against drug trafficking. However, by modeling our legislative framework on the Canadian model, Bermuda is also looking to Canada's experience with regard to maintaining its high anti-money laundering ratings, notwithstanding its lawful cannabis industry. By applying the Canadian lessons, Bermuda can continue to demonstrate our effective anti-money laundering compliance regime during future follow-up reviews of the mutual evaluation report by the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. Madam President, The totality of this proposed legislation provide for better effective regulatory framework for cannabis to displace the illicit market, protect the youth and the vulnerable persons, and finally redress legacy harm-afflicting issues affecting our Black families. It provides fair and equitable access to participate in the proposed market at a time when the economy and families are suffering and searching for new economic opportunities. The passage of this bill and the future implementation will deliver the greatest good for the greatest number. Madam President, I remind this chamber and the listening public to view this bill for what it is. This is a cannabis licensing bill. This is not a cannabis legalization bill. This is not an expungement bill, and it's not a bill to get persons off the stop list. This bill establishes responsible regulation for cannabis to replace the status quo of unlawful, unregulated, unsafe access to the illicit cannabis market in Bermuda, under which the only people who profit are the criminal suppliers, the criminal importers, and cultivators. This bill could never achieve perfection, nor could it deliver on all the things for the diversity of personal opinions, for or against, or for those who are indifferent to the responsible regulation of cannabis. We also need to remember, too, that the negative views on cannabis are influenced by long-standing social conditioning and inherent biases that our society is just now beginning to grapple with. Madam President, I look forward to a very constructive and very thorough review of the merits of this bill, the Cannabis Licensing Act 2021. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Minister and Dr. Peets, Opposition Leader in the Senate and Government Leader in the Senate and spokesperson on legal affairs. Before I open the floor, I would just like to acknowledge the presence in the chamber of the Attorney General, Minister Kathleen Simmons, as well as Acting Permanent Secretary, Ms. Gina Hurst-Mabry. Welcome to both of you. Would any senator care to speak? Senator Jones?
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, let me thank the Senator, Minister Dr. Peets, for this presentation. I thought it was very informative. There were some things that I did not realize in my own personal research that this presentation by the Senate leader has brought some light to. Having said that, Madam President, this government has brought before us a bill today that I believe commercializes corporate cannabis. Now, I do not believe that the Honorable and Learned AG, who I'm glad to see with us this morning, not too sure of all the objectives that she and her team endeavored to accomplish. But by going back and reading some of her press statements and even statements in this chamber, I do believe that the present draft that we have today has gone through many twists and turns. It's been a long journey, and I can appreciate the fact that there was a fair amount of consultation that was held within this community, some of which may not have been as detailed and as comprehensive as we may have liked. But suffice it to say, Madam President, that consultation did take place. On a side note, I would be curious to have heard from different drug prevention and drug treatment professionals in the community. I would have loved to have seen and heard some quotes from them in this presentation so that the community and we in this Senate chambers will have some level of comfort that those that deal with the negative impact of the use and abuse of all forms of illegal drugs, and in this particular debate, specifically cannabis, I would have loved to seen and gotten some comfort from those that deal with this particular, the effects and the impacts on the Bermudian family. I would have loved to seen and heard quotations from that. But be that as it may, Madam President, I do believe that the burden of proof, or more specifically, the burden of persuasion, lays in the hands of the government senators here today to convince us that this bill will, one, whether it will completely decriminalize the use of cannabis. The burden of persuasion rests upon the government senators to convince us that the ability to cultivate cannabis for personal use free for residents of this country, and at the least affordable. I took close note to Minister Peets in his assertion that this fee schedule that's been put out by the government is affordable to the average Bermudian. I would say that that was to some degree tone deaf to what we hear in a community where they can acquire this particular drug over the course of a year and be fairly satisfied without having to go through paying for a personal license of $500 for the license itself, $250 for the application for that personal cultivation license. I would like to think that the government will have a relook at that price point. I believe that this government needs to persuade and give a compelling argument to the community at large that the passage of this bill would do its best to protect the vulnerable in our community from physical, mental, social effects. Most importantly, our youth, the most valuable asset in our community, the next generation. Because we know quite clearly, Madam President, that the part of the negative impact of the use of cannabis on our children is astronomical. There are numerous studies that show and prove that the use of cannabis in and by those of pre-adolescent, adolescent years up to the age of 25 can have a devastating impact upon the from the recipient or the user of these drugs, whether it comes down to memory loss, whether it comes down to poor decision making. We find that the use of this cannabis can create and result in poor performance in school. We see, and we've observed ourselves, our young people that are under the influence of these drugs cannot be, and in some situations, made responsible for their actions, because what this drug does, and I believe to a large degree, this part of the conversation has been lacking, is to emphasize the negative impact that this will have upon our youth, most especially. The burden of persuasion lays upon the government senators to convince us that the black market, that, as Minister Peets shared with us, is profiting from this illicit market, that this market, after the launching of this bill, would, if not remove entirely the black market, and we know that's a pipe dream, but at least have a significant impact on the profitability and the exploitation of the black market. We need to ensure, and this government needs to convince us, that the passage of this bill will not be inaccessible, if that was their intention, for the average Bermudian. As it stands today, this regulatory regime makes it just about inaccessible for the average Bermudian. For those young men that they look to give an opportunity, it will be hardest for them. That is why we on this side of the aisle have labeled this legislation as the commercialization of corporate cannabis. Let us make a couple of things crystal clear, Madam President. Number one, this bill will not remove family members, and friends from off of the U.S. stop list. The U.S. consulate will tell you that as much as we have lobbied and as much as we've asked for the U.S. government to lend us a little bit of grace and mercy, by all indications, that legislation or that law, that U.S. law, will not be changed. Now, that law is not just a policy that customs officers and border patrol officers use their discretion to use. It is the law. It is part of the U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act. And it's not written just for Bermuda, as some may want to think. It is for the entire globe. Every person that is not a citizen of the United States comes under that law. Every country has its own laws that determine who can come in, who's admissible, and who is not. So as much as we sometimes we feel hard done by, that this feels so unfair to our fellow Bermudians, it is something that every citizen of the world has to come to grips with. But we also need to realize that that stop list is not only for drug offenders. That stop list is also for persons that commit white collar crimes, whether it's embezzlement, whether it's fraud. Irregardless of the form and type of crime that you commit, if you commit a crime, then you are putting yourself in a position where you can be inadmissible to the U.S. and you would need to get a visa waiver to get there. So I think that fact needs to be clarified. Madam President, we as Bermudians are very fortunate. We are one of the few countries that do not require a visa to enter the United States. It is a very advantageous position to be in. I would hate to think that after the passage of this bill, that the U.S. government will look at Bermuda differently. Is it possible that once we're seen as a jurisdiction that has embraced and welcomed the commercialization of cannabis, that we may possibly be put into a different category as such of our friends in the South are now put on, where they cannot freely have access to entry into the United States? I would hate to think that that will be the consequence, one of the consequences of the passage of this bill. Madam President, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection claims, and may I read, quote,
Certainly you
if
may.
traveler is found to be coming to the U.S. for reasons related to the cannabis industry, they may be deemed inadmissible. What does that mean, Madam President? That means that if one in this country is in possession of a retail license to sell cannabis in this country and decides to make a trip to the United States for whatever reason, whether it is to purchase equipment or something that's related to the cannabis industry, I believe the public needs to realize that that innocent journey to the United States to gain equipment for your legalized business in Bermuda could put you in jeopardy in the United States of gaining free entry into the United States. I asked the question, and I was completely stunned by the answer that we received when talking to officials within the U.S. consulate. And I believe the public needs to realize that. Madam President, one of the things that this proposed bill does not do, it does not ensure that our youth will not fall afoul to gaining access to this product. And it really gets my attention. And having listened to the debate in another place, there was much spoken about how the criminalization of users of this particular product was disproportionately felt by the Black community. Now, we all know that Bermuda happens to be a country where the majority of its citizens are Black. So it makes sense that if that's the if that's the case, more blacks than not possibly will come under that disproportionate, I would say, unfair criminality of being found in possession of it. But isn't it sort of ironic that this particular product, this illegal product up to this date, that has decimated the black family? All of us have watched how the use and the abuse of this particular drug has caused so much negativity within the black home that now this government wants to give more license for more destruction, for more calamity. It's not enough that the black family has been exploited by unfair laws. Now we're going to put the gun to the black family's head and say, as a government, we're going to validate the usage of this drug without sufficient measures to protect those that fall under the prey of this devastating drug. Now, one of the proposals within this legislation, Madam President, is to make the legal age over the age of 21. But we know from many surveys, many reports, most specifically from the American Psychological Association, who did a publication on marijuana and the developing brain in November of 2015. That, plus many other reports, give very convincing evidence that the use of this particular drug can have devastating effect upon the minds of the youth up to the age of 25. But this government has decided that 21 is the age of allowance to use this drug, when all reports show quite clearly that that mid-20 age is still susceptible to the negative impact of the usage of cannabis. Madam President, how can a government tasked to safeguard its most valuable assets, that being the next generation, make the usage of drug historically be promoted as a detriment to society, and in the next breath, make it easily accessible to the island at large? Madam President, one of the objectives of the mission statement for the Ministry of Education, and may I read a quote, Madam President?
You certainly may, Senator Jones.
To educate the community through educational, social, and recreational resources that prepare, inform, and engage lifelong learning and access to initiatives that meet the needs of Bermuda residents. I will be interested, Madam President, in hearing from the Junior Minister of Education his thoughts on how the legitimizing or the commercialization of the sale of cannabis and its increase in accessibility to the youth of this country fits into that mission statement. Madam President, the Ministry of Security, the Ministry of National Security, the police, the Bermuda Police Service has a mission statement. It's quite simple. It's a 3-word mission statement. It says, making Bermuda safer. I would love to hear from the minister, the Junior Minister of National Security, that can give us some comfort that after the passage of this particular piece of legislation, that the direct exposure to cannabis use now removed will in fact make Bermuda safer. The Ministry of Health, Madam President, they also have a vision. And if you may allow me, I'd like to read it.
You certainly may.
Their mission statement is for an equitable and sustainable health system that promotes and protects the physical, mental, and social well-being of individuals and the community. Can the Junior Minister of Health give the people of Bermuda assurance that the once limiting restraints now relaxed by this new legislation that will be put into place, can he convince us with data, with hardcore facts, that the passage of this bill would in fact decrease instances of drug abuse, decrease and cause there to be less drug addicts, convince us that there will be a fall in incidents of driving under the influence of drugs once their laws are open, has opened up the floodgates of corporate cannabis. I was quite interested in the minister referring to Canada as a jurisdiction by which the cannabis laws have been relaxed. I believe it's been since 2018. And if that is the template and the model that we as a jurisdiction is going to use, then let's listen to a few statistics that come from out of that jurisdiction. Madam President, the Guardian newspaper in April 5th, 2020 states, and may I quote, "The black market in Canada is still vibrant. While cannabis stocks have crashed, medical patients say they can't get hold of essential medicines, and thousands of jobs have been lost." Madam President, Statistics Canada claims that just 29% of cannabis users buy all their products from a legal source, and the price is almost double that of the illegal market. It was found that the consumer purchased low-grade weed for a higher price. Madam President, I submit to you today that the underground black market dealers will be laughing their heads off when they look to see that once this bill is out and being utilized, that at the end of the day, their former clients who's going to come back cash in hand back to their illicit market, because what this government has not realized, based on other jurisdictions, that the cost to actually have an enterprise of legal cannabis sales, its price points and its costs are so high that the consumer is going to be far more apt to go back to the underground black market, Madam President. The potential passage of this corporate cannabis bill, because it's so onerous in its regulations and its price fee structure so high, it will create an exclusive club. Those that are already established businesses, already have deep pockets, have easy access to capital, those are the ones that are going to rise to the top. And unfortunately, contrary to the objectives of the government in making this potential enterprise accessible to the average Bermudian, that will not be the case. Another thing to consider, Madam President, is that Bermuda's soil and climate is not ideal for the cultivation of cannabis. What can be observed in the jurisdiction that we're holding up as a model is that the ones that are profitable, the ones that generate an income that makes sense, the ones that can be deemed as successful are the ones that actually have a multi-million-dollar facility to create the ideal and the perfect cannabis plant. I don't see many of the dealers that I know of that are got that type of money that's stashed away to be able to create a facility or to create an environment that produces the perfect cannabis plant, Madam President. What will happen is that smuggling cannabis illegally into the country for sale will be far cheaper than buying the homegrown product in this country. Madam President, what this legislation will not do, it will not encourage the financial institutions and banks to want to jump at the idea of capitalizing this new emerging industry on the island. Look no further than the gaming industry, Madam President. We find that 4 years ago, laws were enacted to allow for gaming to be legal in Bermuda. Up to this point, 4 years later, we do not have a casino. We do not have a gaming facility in operation 4 years later. several millions of dollars that's been put into this emerging industry, and there's nothing to speak for it at all. This is the potential of what can happen within the emerging cannabis industry. You see how it goes. The banks that we have today on this island, they work hand in hand with corresponding banks. Now, these corresponding banks are very important when it comes to making transactions overseas. Very important when you want to have a business that doesn't depend strictly on cash. Many of these corresponding banks do not want to run afoul of the laws of international countries all around the world. The minister spoke quite candidly about the anti-money laundering regime. The Bermuda has worked hard to produce a gold standard regime. I asked this government the question, will we come under more scrutiny if we take that giant step into the world of legal cannabis? We need to consider that. And the corresponding banks are looking at our jurisdiction very closely. If you go and research and investigate how it has worked in places like Jamaica and other countries to the south, they have many issues that arise from the financial institutions that are unwilling to take that risk. They don't want to manage the risk. They want to eliminate the risk. And so the difficulty arises having to work with these banks when you're going to be producing a product that you expect to trade globally. Madam President, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank produced a report highlighting the challenges that financial institutions have servicing medicinal marijuana made largely available legally in developed countries, let alone recreational cannabis, which remains illegal in many regions around the world. As noted earlier, there's jurisdictions like Canada, Uruguay, that have actually passed the law. And if we watch closely to the things and the obstacles that they have to face, we would think twice. We would be hesitant before we jump headlong into the waters of commercialized corporate cannabis. Madam President, another thing that this legislation will not do, it will not bring comfort to those families in this country that have watched family members being destroyed by this drug. Madam President, I think it's a good time now, as I'm preparing to wind up my chat today, I think it would be appropriate for me to declare my interest in the consumption of marijuana from a personal perspective. My declared interest is that I have no interest at all. My brother and I were raised in the home of a single parent who watched our community be decimated by the illegal and abusive use of drugs. What was once seen as a recreational experience that most people within the community used escalated into something that removed dreams and ambitions from many friends of mine. You may ask me, Madam President, what made you not dip into the waters of testing this cannabis? I will say to you, Madam President, quite candidly, my mother put the fear of God in my brother and I. I will say to you that if we were ever caught using this particular drug, I believe I would rather be taken to the police station than fall into the hands of one Mrs. Mary Lou Jones. But I will say to you, having said that, Madam President, having looked at and talked to many within this community that have an interest in being able to consume cannabis, I had to step back and I had to look at it again. And I had to say to myself, to a consenting adult, should they not have the right to embark and consume cannabis at their will? I had to ask myself that question. Should I impose my values on society as a whole when there's many within this country, whether for religious reasons, whether for medicinal reasons, see the benefits of consuming marijuana? Madam President, if this government would have another look at this legislation and set out to do the things that I felt they intended to do from the first times they talked about it, maybe there will be a place for me to sign off on this particular legislation. But what this legislation does not do, it does not completely decriminalize cannabis use. It doesn't make it accessible to the average Bermudian. That's demonstrated in the high cost of a licensing fee of $750. It doesn't decriminalize cannabis usage because that's demonstrated in the 2 pages of fines and possible imprisonment that will be placed on someone that's found actually peddling this drug without the license. Does this sound like decriminalization to you, Madam President? No, I think it's increasing the level of criminalization. In summary, Madam President, if junior ministers can give comfort, respective of the ministries that they represent, that the passage of this bill does not require them to rewrite their mission statements that obligates them to ensure a safe and healthy environment for the citizens of this country, especially the youth. If this government can convince us that the profitable black market that facilitates the sale of cannabis will be significantly impacted, reduced to being just a fringe player in this enterprise.
Point of order, Madam President.
What is your point of order?
Madam President, I believe Honorable Senator Jones is misleading the House. Senator George wouldn't have any bill to put in front of him that he would support. The Senate is in the place to discuss bills passed by the democratically elected chamber. He's made no suggestions, as he wouldn't support any bill, just as he didn't support decriminalization. He has no moral authority to discuss specifics.
Objection, Madam President.
Not
May I-
a point of order.
That's not a point of order. He's reading something that someone sent him, and that's not a proper point of order. So, Madam President, without any more interruption, I will continue. Madam President, if this government can convince us that the decriminalization of cannabis in its truest sense can be experienced by residents, right, and make it available for the average Bermudian, if this government can convince us that banks, whether they're local banks or corresponding banks, will be able to join in and be part of the capitalization of this commercial enterprise, then there is a possibility that we can sign off on this bill. Many within the community have said this particular proposal is half-stepping. Either come big or go home. As much as it would be, shall we say, uncomfortable, an idea and a concept, it will stick in line to what I believe the AG has put in place or desired to do. This proposed legislation does not do this. So I encourage my colleagues to object to this motion, to accept it, and let it be sent back to the AG chambers for a rethink and a rewrite. The people of this country demand it. The next generation deserves it. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Jones. Senator Michelle Simmons, you had indicated earlier that you wanted to speak. You have the floor.
It's still morning. Good morning again, Madam President. Madam President, I have studied this bill before us today very carefully because I really wanted to be fair to the process that all of us here in the Senate are charged with, of reviewing legislation which comes to us after passage through the other chamber, and through debate, through discussion, perhaps even effecting some change. First of all, I want to thank Madam Attorney General, the Honorable Attorney General, and her technical officers who are here with us today for a very, very useful meeting with the independent senators earlier this week. The information shared and the discussions which followed, I found very helpful. From my reading of the bill, I see that government wants to establish a cannabis licensing regime that would see funds generated from such licenses paid into the government's consolidated fund. I also want to thank the Honorable Minister Peets for his presentation this morning, because he has set out before us the various licenses, and therefore there's no need for us to repeat that list of licenses that will be available for people to apply for. I do have questions about the bill, and I'm going to start with one about the number of licenses that will be issued. I would imagine that government has some idea of the number of licenses in each category that it's aiming to, I guess, issue. And that is an important point because it will also inform the work of the Cannabis Licensing Authority, which is about to be established if this bill passes. I noted from information received this week at the briefing we had that in order to establish the Cannabis Licensing Authority, funds will be drawn from the budget of the National Drug Commission, I should say the Department of National Drug Control. And I emphasize the name, the Department of National Drug Control. Their budget allocation, part of it anyway, will be used to establish staff for the Cannabis Licensing Authority. That gives me cause for some concern, Madam President. We seem to be sending a rather confusing message to the public. On one hand, there are government agencies which have been established to work toward drug prevention. And now we have a proposed new government program for the licensing of various activities associated with a cannabis industry, a drug industry. Further, the minister responsible for drug prevention is the same minister who is establishing the Cannabis Licensing Authority. To me, that's very confusing. I'm not sure how members of the public are responding to that, but it seems to be sending a double-bind message, confusion. Let me be clear about my stance with regard to medical or medicinal cannabis as prescribed by a practicing physician. I do support that. There's no doubt in my mind that there are some benefits to patients who are prescribed medicinal cannabis by their physicians. However, cannabis is a drug. And my next question is, should we be encouraging people to use this for recreational purposes? Or is it a drug that we should be advising people not to use, since we know it causes both physical and mental impairment? The government says in the brief from this morning that use of cannabis is probably a lower risk or causes less harm than alcohol and tobacco use. But does this take into consideration the period of time over which cannabis is being consumed and the potency of it? I have personally seen young people who started using cannabis in their teenage years, who now, as grown adults, are totally unable to function in society. And that's through cannabis use. Madam President, I did some research, and several studies I've read have shown that cannabis use and addiction are affecting young people in a disproportionate way. And let me be clear about that. I'm referring to what studies have shown with regard to how cannabis has affected young people versus older adults. For example, Madam President, in the United States, of those going to rehabilitation for addiction to cannabis, 45% are under 21 years of age. And I'll repeat that. 45% are under the age of 21. Now, if you step the age up a bit more and go to age 24 and under, the percentage rises to 55%. That should be alarming for all of us, because it's saying quite clearly that young people are very vulnerable to using cannabis. Madam President, let me list some of the negative impacts of cannabis use. Distortion of time and space perception, impaired coordination. Could all of this be helping to contribute to the increased risk of reckless riding and traffic collisions in Bermuda on our roads? Young people have difficulty thinking or problem solving. They suffer from impairment of memory. They suffer from, unfortunately, low levels of learning. In school-age students, and I've seen this, you will see behaviors such as truancy, habitual tardiness, fighting, stealing, vandalism, the list goes on. And I'll end the list with low self-esteem. Schoolwork and the achievement of goals also suffer. Heavy users of cannabis suffer damage to social life, work, or career status, and cognitive ability. Cannabis use is associated with increased rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, including adolescent suicide. That's a list that should get our attention. It should make us all pause and ponder and think, are we doing what's in the best interest of our young people? Are we doing what's in the best interest of the next generation? Are we doing what's in the best interest of this community? As a former educator, no, I'm still an educator. As an educator, I have witnessed firsthand how cannabis use has impacted school-age students. And it is my wish to see fewer, not more, young people engaging in cannabis use. I was alarmed when I read parts, because it's quite a big document, of the most recent school drugs survey conducted in 2019, which showed that the onset age of cannabis use was as low as 9.6 years. Yes, Madam President, we have children in our primary schools who are using cannabis. It's easy for people to have access to cannabis. What are we doing to safeguard our children? What are we doing to educate them about the negative effects of cannabis use? Does every school, every primary, middle, senior school, public and private, have effective education and prevention programs? Unfortunately, Madam President, I already know the answer to that. The programs are woefully inadequate. That, Madam President, in my humble opinion, should be our priority, to make sure that educational programs, drug prevention programs are in place for our most vulnerable. I was shocked to learn about a year ago that one of the drug treatment programs in Bermuda, which was established to work with our young people, had been closed. I don't know why, but it has left a huge gap in service. Madam President, again, some of the studies I've read show that long-term chronic use and higher dosages of cannabis are found to correlate with a greater incidence of psychosis and schizophrenia. Madam President, I know I'm addressing you and the entire community right now, but you are a healthcare professional, and I know that you're so much aware of this. This point is particularly significant due to the increase in drug potency over the years. And I believe this most recent study I read said drug potency has continued to increase over the past 2 decades. While the average potency has risen, Madam President, from 3% tetrahydrocannabinol, THC for short, a couple of decades ago, it can now vary from 9% all the way up to a high of 25%. Madam President, if we walk around the city of Hamilton, we will see a number of people on our streets who are there not necessarily because they choose to be there, but unfortunately, due to drug abuse issues which have never been treated, they find themselves unable to function in society. It was very interesting that I passed a situation as I walked here this morning. It was happening on the steps of the cathedral. And I believe it was centered around someone who was having an issue. Perhaps it's related to drug abuse, perhaps it's led to a mental health issue. But we know for a fact that this is happening here in Bermuda right now. One of the arguments, Madam President, that government is putting forward for the licensing of cannabis is that it's too expensive to continue to have all these major court trials. Further, the incarceration of individuals is very costly. In my opinion, it would be a lot cheaper for us to invest in our young people and spend funds on effective drug education and prevention programs. I know I sound like a broken record right now, Madam President, but I cannot leave this alone. Education is a key component in helping people to understand the consequences of drug use. And it is essential that all our schools are equipped with teachers who've been trained and resources to ensure that children understand, that they get the message as to the consequences of their decisions to use cannabis and any other drug. Also, treatment programs, as I mentioned a minute ago. We need to make sure that there are treatment programs that are specifically geared to our young people. Madam President, I've talked with local drug treatment officials, and I have found that programs are struggling for funding. However, on the other hand, if the problem is that the programs that are in place right now are ineffective, then changes need to be made so that new, more effective programs are introduced. I feel that more effort needs to be made to tackle the underlying cause of drug use. And government funding is critical to the success of such programs. That is why on page 9, clause 15, subsection 4 of the bill, I was wondering, Madam President, why it reads as follows. And may I just go ahead and read that?
Yes, you may. Senator.
The minister may direct that a percentage of sums received from license fees be applied for the following purposes. A, the strengthening of social programs related to drug abuse prevention and treatment. That's the end of the quote. Madam President, I would respectfully suggest that that section should read, the minister shall direct. This will make it a requirement that the minister must use a portion of the funds derived from licenses to strengthen social programs related to drug abuse prevention and treatment. Madam President, of course, my comments, my remarks have been focused mainly on the effects of cannabis use on our young people. So let me just go a little bit further. According to the bill, people under 21 are not permitted to use or will not be permitted to use. If this bill passes through the Senate and is then signed into law, we will still have the problems that we have today, with many persons under the age of 21 having easy access to cannabis, whether through the materials sold in licensed premises or indeed from the black market. Let's not fool ourselves, Madam President, into thinking that the illegal drug trade will cease. It will not. In the bill, the intention is that all cannabis sold in licensed stores should be consumed there. We all know some people will not adhere to that and will want to take some of their purchase home for use later. If someone is caught doing this, as long as they are in possession of less than 7 grams of cannabis, they won't suffer any legal consequence. However, this also means that the cannabis they take away could end up in the hands of someone else, perhaps even a school student. Madam President, the government says that this bill will bring real change and economic opportunities. However, I spent time researching other jurisdictions which have a regulated cannabis trade. And I found this. Since January 1st, 2018, when the state of California effected a legal commercial cannabis market, even though cannabis had been legal for medicinal use since 1996, the state put in place a regulated market. But what they've found is the regulated market has done a fraction of the business that was expected. And that was due to the fact that there were very few licensed cannabis stores. I don't know why. They don't know why. However, the state has shown that more cannabis is being grown and sold illegally in the black market. And it has been estimated, Madam President, that the black market is much larger than the legal industry. Therefore, the state has not really benefited very much in terms of increased tax revenue. I also looked at the state of Colorado, which has had recreational cannabis since 2014. One report noted that cannabis arrests, mostly for sale and possession, were cut by more than half. That's impressive, from 2012 to 2017. But what increased, Madam President, was arrests for growing the plant illegally. That increased by more than 50%. 50%. So, and seizures of illegal cannabis have skyrocketed in Colorado as people attempt to circumvent the state's licensing regime. Further, Madam President, here in Bermuda, I have already been told that there are some persons with great means who are standing by, waiting, looking forward to availing themselves of licenses to grow and sell cannabis. These are not persons who have been disadvantaged economically in the past. Therefore, since the government wants to encourage entrepreneurship in this new industry, will there be a means test for those applying for licenses? Or will there be some kind of rank ordering of those who apply so that those who appear to have been economically disadvantaged in the past receive an advantage? Just wondering. Madam President, I'm close to concluding my remarks. Just a few more points. My greatest fear about this bill is that there will be increased cannabis use, even by people who would never have considered using cannabis in the past. And that's because it was illegal to do so. I know not everyone agrees with that statement, but I believe it. I also believe this will be followed by an increase in the associated negative issues associated with cannabis use. We do not need, and the we is Bermuda. We in Bermuda do not need to introduce another legal intoxicant into our society. And I know some would say, well, the intoxicant is already here. But by making it legal to grow, to sell, to transport, to bake, to produce, to manufacture items associated with cannabis, is it not true that our government is trying to encourage use of cannabis? I would hope not. By the way, Madam President, I know that we often feel that Bermuda is another world. Many say it a bit too often for my liking. But my research has shown that there are more than 50 countries that have adopted medicinal cannabis programs, while, and this may surprise people, there are only 3 countries all over the globe, 3, that have legalized recreational use of cannabis. And those countries are Canada, South Africa, and Uruguay. We can add to the mix 14 out of the 50 US states, 2 territories of the United States, and the District of Columbia. That's it. Do we want to go down this road? Madam President, there are a few things in the bill that I would still like to point out. On page 14, clause 24F, subsection 1. Sorry. This is the section that deals with the inspection of premises prior to, application for a license. And it indicates in section F1 that there needs to be evidence that the applicant, may I read this, Madam President?
Yes, you certainly may, Senator Simmons.
Owns the premises on which the activities which are the subject of the license will be carried on. And then in subsection 2, it talks about the written agreement with the owner of those premises to use the premises for those activities, and a survey or other plan of the land comprising the premises on which the premises are situated. I wondered why there's no need in subsection 1 for a survey or a plan of the land. I know the difference between the two sections is, subsections rather, is that in 1, the applicant owns the premises, and in subsection 2, they are renting premises. But surely it would be helpful to have a survey of the premises in both instances. Anyway, that was just something I noted. Also on page 36, in Schedule 3, Clause 4.2a and Clause 4.3a, I just wondered, again, why they are so different in terms of requiring off-site security surveillance in 3A, but not requiring off-site security surveillance in 2A. Just asking. And then further around on page 50, I noted what comes across to me as ambiguous wording. This is under the heading Mandatory Condition of Retail Shop License, Section 10, subsection 1. The holder of a license, his servant or agent, shall examine the photographic identification as proof of age of any person seeking entry into the retail shop who appears to be under the age of 21 before granting access. It's the before granting access that makes it a little ambiguous, because it almost sounds as though you're just going to check their license. Even if they're under 21, they may still get access. So it just needs to be tidied up so that there's no misinterpretation. Madam President, what changes will we see if this bill is passed? Number one, licenses must be purchased to grow, import, sell, export, transport, manufacture a cannabis product, or conduct research. Two, government will now be involved, even though it's on the periphery, but government will be involved in the cannabis industry. Three, there will be increased use of cannabis by adults. There will be, four, there will still be an active black market for cannabis. Five, there will be continued use of cannabis by people under the age of 21, including school-age children. So what does Bermuda gain? Madam President, in my opinion, nothing. Nothing that will help to improve our community. Madam President, my fellow senators, all those listening on radio or online, we have to accept responsibility for keeping our families and especially our young people safe. My greatest concern about this proposed bill is that it does not do anything to keep our children and youth safe. By adopting this bill, we will be laying a very heavy burden on our community at a time when we need to focus our collective energies and wisdom on finding ways of pulling ourselves out of these economic doldrums. A cannabis industry is not the answer to increasing government revenue. It is not the answer to decriminalization. Madam President, I cannot and I do not support this bill. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Michelle Simmons. Senators, I think that we've had 3 submissions. Does anyone want to speak briefly? We will up for lunch at 12:30, or at least Senator Senator White, you would like to speak briefly?
Thank
You-
you, Madam
You
President.
have the floor.
Yes, I'll be very brief as I normally am. So the headline for me, following my read of the bill and discussions with the Bermuda medical profession, family welfare groups, and other stakeholders in Bermuda, is that I have great concerns about this bill. The lens through which I've reviewed this bill prioritizes the health and welfare of Bermudians. The COVID-19 pandemic in Bermuda has been managed extraordinarily well by government. The main reason for this is that they focused on the science as their priority, public health above the economy. So with my priority being public health, particularly for our young adults, I sought first what the medical experts in Bermuda felt about this bill and its potential health consequences. And secondly, with cannabis having been decriminalized and commercialized in a number of states in the US, with Colorado being the first, what firsthand statistics Bermuda might draw from to determine what we might likely see in Bermuda. My first point of reference in understanding the health risks was to read what the medical experts in Bermuda felt about cannabis and its effects on people. Some may recall that the 2018 throne speech referred to the possibility of a medicinal cannabis regime for Bermuda. The then chief medical officer in Bermuda produced her report, a public document, in October of 2019 on her thoughts. And with your permission, I'll just read one paragraph from that
Certainly, you
document.
may, Senator White.
So her final paragraph of her report spoke volumes to me. It said, most important in the role of the chief medical officer is the responsibility to protect and improve the health of people of Bermuda. The potential risk to physical health, mental health, the social and psychological well-being of the people of the island with the current proposal is significant. Feedback on health concerns was previously provided by the Bermuda Medical Council. Developing a health-related industry which may not be able to attain the necessary regulatory and quality standards is a risk that we can ill afford to underestimate. There is potential for lasting harm to the well-being of the people and the prosperity of Bermuda. That is from the then Chief Medical Officer of Bermuda. I then contacted the Bermuda Medical Council, which is now the Bermuda Medical Doctors Association, to seek their views on this legislation, to be advised that there has been no consultation with government, which I found very unusual. If we are prioritizing the health of our island, why wouldn't the governing body for medical practitioners be consulted with prior to this bill being submitted to MPs and senators to vote on? I won't reiterate what Senator Simmons referred to with the Colorado statistics, but they were quite alarming to me in terms of the increased emergency room visits, increases in psychosis, suicide, increases in fatal motor vehicle collisions, and a number of other alarming statistics. I've spoken with family welfare groups in Bermuda, and I've learned, not surprisingly, that the number of families adversely affected by drug addiction continues to rise. The view of one prominent, highly respected professional in Bermuda who I spoke to was this: regardless of the adult views on smoking cannabis as a pleasure or a vice, the legislation, if passed, will establish a norm and send a message to our young people that will greatly reinforce their acceptance of it as a norm. As is proven with data, smoking weed does become an addictive substance for them and is a significant barrier to finding unemployment, housing, and a contributing place in society. There is much material data that shows the effect of smoking weed on a person's ability to think clearly and effectively. For youngsters who start early, it interferes with their executive functioning skills and their ability to make good judgments. This, in my view, is very concerning views from a family welfare expert who deals with these issues on a daily basis. While I prioritize public health above all on this matter, which I'm not qualified on, and thus I sought views from health and public welfare experts, the matter of economics on this bill is much closer to my educational background and experiences in the workforce. From reading the bill, the one certainty is the spending to develop the infrastructure for this, which is not minimal. There's reference in the bill to the hiring of executive directors, to the requirement for inspectors, analysts, to even the payment of the people on the authority. But I have not seen any projections on the revenue side of the equation. And as I listened to the Minister of Finance deliver his budget speech, he referred to the fragility of our economy. So this uncertainty does not align, in my view, with the fragility of Bermuda's economy. The comment I've heard recently that Bermudians will smoke cannabis with or without this legislation doesn't resonate with me. The time for leaders to put values ahead of politics is now. This bill sends a dangerous and concerning message to our youth in particular. I'm not willing to jeopardize the health of more Bermudians so that a limited few may benefit financially from commercializing a product that has so many detrimental physical and mental consequences and compromises the healthy brain development of our young adults. To repeat my opening remarks, the government has done an outstanding job managing the COVID-19 pandemic and related issues in Bermuda. This was accomplished by prioritizing public health over the economy. They listened to the science. As relates to the bill entitled Cannabis Licensing Act 2020, I ask the government reconsider this bill and again prioritize the science and health of our community above all else. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator White. Senators, it is now 12:30, and I am recommending that we adjourn for lunch. And we will return at 2 o'clock. Yes, not 2:15 as we normally do. We'll come back at